tonight's special guest speaker, Dr. John Moore, is a biology professor at Florida Atlantic University's Wilkes Honors College. Dr. Moore is an expert in the biology and ecology of deep-sea fishes. He holds a master's and a PhD from Yale and has been conducting research on Florida's ecosystems for nearly 20 years. While fish are a specialty, Dr. Moore has worn a lot of different hats during his career, from gopher tortoises and lizards to manatees, even lichens. So we've got a speaker who has a very broad expertise, and John's been nice enough to speak as part of the lecture series in the past. And I don't often invite speakers back, but John is such a great speaker and has such a cool repertoire of research. I really wanted to bring him back for you guys. So tonight, he's going to tell us about his research on the impacts of the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. It's with great pleasure that I welcome John Moore to the stage.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. This project actually came out of the original oil spill investigation by NOAA. And so a number of the folks who are listed here are some of my colleagues who were there right after the spill started. And then the rest of this cast of thousands includes project members from the Deep End project, which was an extension that followed after NOAA had finished all of its investigation and BP had paid the fines in 2015, 2016, and this continued research until 2018. And now several of us have gotten funding from NOAA to continue with research for the next 5 to 10 years to continue monitoring what's going on in the deep waters. So the Gulf of Mexico has a fairly large fish fauna that's known, about 1,500, almost 1,600 species. And one thing that people forget, because they're coming out from the shoreline and you take a look at the shelf off of West Florida or off of East Texas and Louisiana, the continental shelf is really wide in many places. So people think of the Gulf of Mexico as a shallow water basin, except for 90% of all the volume of the Gulf of Mexico is actually below 200 meters or about 660 feet, and that qualifies as the deep sea. So most of the Gulf of Mexico is actually deep sea habitat. Okay, so as a reminder of what happened nearly 20 years ago, next month is the 10-year anniversary of the explosion and sinking of the Deepwater Horizon. This goes by a number of names. NOAA preferred using the DWHOS for Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It's also known widely as the BP oil spill. The Macondo well was the actual well that was being drilled at the time, and then MC-252 is sometimes used. That was the lease that the well was within, the lease block. And looking at the infrastructure for the oil extraction in 2009, just before the blowout, all those little circles are well rigs. And then all of the lines are actual pipelines that are connecting these two onshore facilities and such. Florida made a choice long ago that its beaches and tourism were more important than oil extraction. And so the legislature banned any sort of drilling within 125 miles of the shoreline. And that's why there's nothing but one pipeline that goes through a refinery in Tampa that represents the only infrastructure on the Florida coastline. And some of these areas are really thickly populated with rigs. I mean, you're out there in some of the denser areas, and it looks like there's cities on the horizon because of the lights from all of the different rigs. So, April 20th, 2010, there was a methane gas pulse that came up through the riser into the rig itself, ignited, and that explosion destroyed much of the Deepwater Horizon as a rig, killed 11 individuals, and led to this massive oil spill that followed. The cleanup project was initially funded by BP. They threw in a pool of nearly $14 billion saying, just do what you need to do to clean up the oil. Because there had been previous spills, there were vessels like this skimmer ship out there where they used the boom to actually wrangle up some of that oil, pull it in, and then use a vacuum to literally just take it off the surface. And so some of the oil was recovered in that way. Because of the oil contaminating the waters, a lot of fishing was shut down in the vicinity along the Louisiana and Mississippi coasts in particular. And so displaced fishermen also got hired by BP in order to try and collect some of the oil, but they didn't have enough skimmer ships, so what they used were these oil-absorbent booms. And so these shrimpers are all just dragging oil-absorbent booms to collect some of the oil. A lot of oil actually got recovered in this way. But for many of the ships that didn't have booms, another option was actually to burn the oil at sea. And so there was a lot of this going on, so much so that for a period of time, air quality was really suffering for the Gulf Coast communities. Another tactic for trying to get rid of the oil was spraying dispersants. And dispersants are sort of like a mixture of solvents that are petroleum-based as well as soaps. And these make the oil disperse into micro droplets. And so Halliburton, which was one of the companies involved with the Deepwater Horizon well, had a really large stockpile of dispersants and sold them to NOAA in order to try and get rid of some of the oil at the surface. But there was so much oil coming out of the well that we started seeing what's known as oil mousse. The churning of all of this oil turns it into a frothy mix. And then also there's a lot of volatiles that are evaporating off of the oil, and sunlight photodegrades a bunch of the chemicals as well. So it turns into this orangey brown mass instead of the black oil that we're used to thinking about as crude oil. And that mousse eventually made its way to the shoreline. They tried setting up oil-absorbent booms around marshes and islands and such to protect them, but a few storms that intervened messed up that whole system. And so oil mousse got to a number of these different marshes and actually caused all kinds of environmental damage in many places. So with the current systems that run through this area, there's a current that runs from the Caribbean through the Yucatan Channel there between western Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. And sometimes it slides right over to this area and becomes the Florida Current and then the Gulf Stream. But other times it extends into the Gulf of Mexico here and becomes what's known as the loop current, because it actually does a 180-degree turn. And the loop current is very important for a number of reasons. It enhances biodiversity in the entire Gulf of Mexico. It's responsible for delivering reef fishes and reef corals and such to some of the sites up north. So for instance, the Flower Gardens National Marine Sanctuary up in the Texas coast is the northernmost Gulf reefs. And it also delivers reef animals to the Florida Keys and such. So it does a lot. And at the time of the spill, the black here represents the extent of the oil. Much of the oil was in the northern part, but one streamer actually got entrained into the loop current itself. And Florida government freaked out. They were really worried that all this crude oil or mousse was going to end up washing down the west coast and damaging the beaches on the west coast of the peninsula, then getting into the Keys and even potentially all the way up the Atlantic seaboard. And so they were very, very concerned about the impacts this oil would have on tourism and all sorts of other things, as well as just the environmental damage. But about a month or so after the spill started, the loop current began to pinch off. And when the top of the current pinches off, it becomes an eddy that just sort of spins in place and slowly makes its way westwards towards the Texas coast. And so that eddy that formed, and you can see in the lower image, by July, the eddy was in full strength and completely separated from the loop current. That eddy blocked a bunch of the surface oil and kept it in the northern Gulf, which was not great for those states, but for Florida, it meant that very little apparent oil made it to the coastline. It was mostly portions of the western panhandle that had tar and oil coming ashore. So what was going on during this spill was that BP was attempting to try and prevent as much material getting onto the surface as possible. And so one of the things they proposed and got permission to do was to put a feeder here that actually injected dispersant directly into the oil coming out of the wellhead. This is the wellhead right here. And so the idea was to pump dispersant in there and try and mitigate any kind of slick at the surface. So this was what they were thinking they could do, just throw so much dispersant in there and end up with oil not getting to the surface. This was what they were hoping. Not quite how it happened, though. So, if they had left it alone, all that oil would have pretty much gone to the surface. There would have been massive slicks. The idea of putting that dispersant into the wellhead would create lots of micro droplets, and there are bacteria that feed on oil in the Gulf of Mexico. And so it was thought, well, the bacteria could take care of the problem, but not with the volumes of oil that were spewing out of that wellhead. It was so much oil coming through that, yeah, some of it stayed down at depth, but a lot of it still got on the surface and had to be dealt with. And no one quite had an idea that this plume of microdroplets actually existed at depth until there were some cruises of research vessels going out and sampling through the entire water column. And you can see oxygen really high here at the surface, where the surface churning of water keeps it oxygenated. You get down to something that's known as the oxygen minimum zone, typically in that 400 to 500 meters down. And then it rises as oxygenated water from other sources makes sort of layers, stacked layers of water in the water column. But they got this funny anomalous signal right here where oxygen dipped down. And that was an indication of something like bacterial activity. Well, also the black line here represents water clarity. And you see water clarity really diminishes at that same depth. And then CDOM, which is the carbon dissolved organic material, also spiked at that depth. So that was indicating something was going on down there. And so they sent an ROV down, and at the surface, things are looking clear, 170 meters, 890 meters, you're starting to see a little bit of particulate. At 1,100 meters, it was described as a fog. The lights from the ROV, the remote sub, were actually being reflected off of all these micro droplets in the water. And below that, once you got down to like 1,300 meters, it was clear again. So there was an interval here of roughly about 1,000 to 1,200 meters where they were running through this fog of oil micro droplets. And further examination determined that this was actually a plume coming from the well itself, and this is what that dispersant being injected directly had done, was created a river of microdroplets that extended for almost 250 miles westward from the well. This was determined about a month or two into the spill, and this is when NOAA realized, oh my gosh, we've got to worry about what's going on in the deep waters as well as what's happening at the bottom and at the surface. And so this was when my colleagues and I were sort of called in to try and figure out how is this plume of micro droplets of oil impacting deep sea animals. So the Office of Response and Restoration was responsible for doing the Natural Resources Damage Assessment, or NRDA, which was part of the whole suit against BP and its violation of the Clean Water Act. And so they got us to put together this particular program, the Offshore Nekton Sampling and Analysis Program. Nekton are free-swimming animals that are not plankton. And so this would be fish and crustaceans and squid of a moderate to large size. And they set us up initially with one vessel, a NOAA vessel that could pull a high-speed rope trawl through the water. And the first cruise on that generated so much information, but one of the failings was that it was information that went through the entire water column. There was no way of looking at what's happening at different layers. And so very quickly, another vessel was contracted to use a different kind of net, what's known as a mock nest, or multiple opening closing net. And a mock nest actually, in this case, carried 6 different nets that opened up at different times and different depths, so that you could actually sample the layers of the layer cake and figure out what was going on. The mock nest is a complex piece of equipment and is much, much smaller. The opening itself is 10 square meters, and the high-speed rope trawl is enormous. But they sample in different ways and sample different components of the fauna. So actually, they were very complementary in being used. So here's a person standing next to a mock nest to give you a sort of sense of scale. And then here's the high-speed rope trawl, and that, in the circle, is the person. The high-speed rope trawl is big enough that if they turned the vessel around and the net stayed open, they could drive the boat in. So this is looking at the sizes of all of the animals, all the individual animals that were caught. And the reddish, pinkish ones represent the Mach 10, and the purplish, bluish ones are the high-speed rope trawl. And you see that the Mach 10 was really good at getting smaller individuals, especially larvae, juveniles, and small adults. And then the high-speed rope trawl got us animals that were almost 9 feet long at maximum sizes. And these are just some examples of the sorts of things we caught. Not just fishes, crustaceans, and squid, but also really large jellyfish here. This is a 20 centimeter scale, so roughly about 8 inches across. And all just amazing diversity each time the nets were opened up. Mach 10 was a little different, and we set up this stratified sampling. So the first net actually goes from the surface to 1,500 meters, which we determined as the bottom of our sampling. 1,500 meters is 5,000 feet down. That's pretty deep. But remember, the plume was measured at the 1,000 to 1,200 meter depth strata. So this first net that opens up after the first one closes, so the second net actually, represents the deepest strata below where the plume was. This one represents the plume strata, and then these 3 are subdivisions of the water column above where the plume was. And so this gave us a better way of examining what was happening at different depths within the water column. Well, when BP paid the fines and agreed to the settlement, NOAA was done. And so the Natural Resources Damage Assessment was complete because the lawsuit was finished. So we got funding from another source to use a different vessel, but basically the same Mach net system, and continue trawling for the next 4 years to continue our sample series as we were working through what happened after the oil spill. So what did we catch? I do have to credit my friend and colleague Dante Fenolio from the San Antonio Zoo. He's our on-shipboard photographer for all of this. And so these are images of all sorts of organisms that we've collected at sea, and he's out there on this container van in the bow of the vessel while it's rocking around and everything, and taking these spectacular photos of all these different animals. So, I said that nearly 1,600 species were in the Gulf of Mexico, known to be in the Gulf of Mexico. What we have collected as far as fishes go, whoops, we're going the wrong way, aren't we? There we go. So nearly 900 species of fishes alone collected. So we're getting a really large sampling of the entire fish diversity known from the Gulf of Mexico, just in this one area around where Deepwater Horizon was. The single most abundant thing is this animal right here, the pallid bristlemouth. This is a small fish, all of about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long, and is basically the deep sea equivalent of anchovies. They're in really large numbers, and everyone eats them. And so 1/3 of everything we caught was one of these pallid bristlemouths. And what we caught with the NRDA was roughly around 300,000 fish. So that's a lot of fish. 100,000 of them were that little bugger. As far as other really diverse groups that we collected, these dragonfishes were the largest family, the most species that we collected out of any family. And so globally, there's almost 300 species. We got over 100 just in the Gulf of Mexico. And these, well, you know, the pallid bristlemouth is the anchovy. Well, lanternfishes are the herrings. They're also in really large numbers, but they're bigger bodied, and so larger predators prefer them. So this is a favorite food of things like tunas and dolphins and toothed whales and all sorts of other things. And these are really interesting too because the lanternfishes participate in a vertical migration. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but just keep this image of these fishes in mind. And then in the really deeper strata, down below 1,000 meters, one of the things that we got, not in huge numbers, but really surprising diversity, were all of these deep-sea anglerfishes. And we got 61 species, which was incredible. Many of them were new records. 4 of them are thought to be new species, one of which has already been described. We're still working through some of the others. So almost 900 species of fishes, 186 of them were not previously recorded from the Gulf of Mexico. So that was a big addition to the previous 1,541 species. The groups that gave us the most new records were things like the anglerfishes, the dragonfishes, and eels. The Mach ness is really good at getting larval and larger post-larval juvenile fishes, and eels like this, and the larval form leptocephaly, we got a lot of. I just published a paper on the results of this work, and I was able to identify 9,000 individuals to 118 species. That is a lot of fish to look at. So looking at orders of fishes, there's a bunch of deep sea fishes that you would expect, and so number 1 and number 2, Stomiiformes and Myctophiformes. Myctophiformes are all those lanternfish. And Stephanobarissiformes and Alopiformes also really abundant. So, okay, a lot of what we got were deep sea fishes, but a lot of what we also got were more surface-dwelling fish. And so we got Perciformes, those are perch-like fishes, Leptocephali, which are the eel larvae, and Pleuronectiformes are all the flounders. What are flounders doing out 150 miles away from the coast? Well, a lot of them were juveniles and larvae like this one right here. The Perciformes were really diverse too. Everything from butterfly fishes and surgeon fishes to snappers and jacks and all sorts of other things, most of which were coastal species. And the eels, as I said, 126 species is what we've recognized in counting adults and also using some molecular barcode techniques. 118 were just what I was able to identify from these Leptocephalus larvae. Let me tell you, how to identify these guys is often counting how many of these individual muscle blocks you see there, because there's a one-to-one correspondence between those and the number of vertebra. And so I don't know how many times I would be working on a specimen on board the vessel, and one of my colleagues would go, "Hey, John," and it's like, "Oh, dang, I lost count." And so they really got used to leaving me alone until I looked up from the microscope, and then they're like, "Okay, you're good." So one of the realizations that comes out of all of this work on these fishes and also the crustaceans and such is that the Gulf of Mexico is not split into coastal and oceanic. The oceanic had all of these different coastal species out there as juveniles, lurking and waiting for the next time a current brings them back to shore. And so we've got a butterfly fish, a triggerfish, this is a squirrelfish, and a flounder, amongst some of the things that we saw out there. And this squirrelfish is actually a specialized juvenile form that's a pelagic form that literally allows this to hang out offshore until it gets brought back towards reefs. And so we found a number of these species adapted for that sort of persistence, even though the bottom where they were captured was 5,000 feet down or more. We do have several potential new species that we're still trying to describe, and so that's time-consuming, and it will take several years before we get all of those fully described. So what comes out of this is not just, cool fish like this ogre fish here, otherwise known as a fangtooth. Not just deep sea things, but over 50% of all the fish known from the Gulf of Mexico are there in pelagic waters far offshore. Okay, so I mentioned the vertical migration. This is actually a sonar image of the vertical migration. So during the day, a whole bunch of things like those bristlemouths and lanternfishes hang out at depth, typically in the 400 to 600 meters interval. And what they're doing is avoiding any sort of visual predators during the day. Tunas and jacks and other things that might eat them fairly readily. Can't see them nearly as well in those dark depths, and a good many of them don't go diving that deep. Well, come dusk, and there's a big migration. Many of these fishes, crustaceans, and squid actually swim towards the surface because that's where the abundant food is. And at night, you see this green here is all of this really dense accumulation of animals in the first 100 meters or 300 feet of the water column. And they're feeding like crazy on the abundant food resources while the visual predators are all sleeping. Come dawn, and many of them make the return migration down to those ocean depths. So think about it. Those pallid bristlemouths and other small fishes like this are making a 4 or so 100-meter migration twice a day. This is the world's largest migration. It's just out of sight, and so people hadn't realized this stuff was going on, except among some of the ichthyologists and marine biologists. It's amazing. And one of the other conclusions that comes out of this work that we've been doing is that the Gulf of Mexico actually is a hyper-diverse body of water and is similar to a few other really diverse areas, the upwelling there and the South China Sea and the basin between New Caledonia and Australia. Really exceptional biodiversity in those 4 pockets, and the Gulf of Mexico is ours. So we ought to be trying to protect all this biodiversity that occurs there. And these are just a sampling, again, of some of the invertebrates, including the giant clam shrimp there, and this transparent amphipod, and all sorts of wild and crazy things. I caught one of these many, many years ago off of a seamount up in New England, and we had no idea what it was. And so for many years, it was known as the funky purple thing. It took a crustacean biologist to tell us, oh, that's a juvenile of Plesiopeneus, of course. Another conclusion that comes out of our work is that the pelagic habitat is really integral for the entire ecosystem, for the coastal as well as the bottom and as well as the open waters. And as an example of this, this is a tagged big-eye tuna, and watching what it does each day. And so during the day, it's down at depth. At night, it's at the surface. Day, depth, night, surface. It's following that migration of myctophids, the lanternfishes, and other animals. That's what it's feeding on. And if you open up the stomach of big-eye tunas and Atlantic bluefins and such, you find a lot of deep-sea animals in there. So because of this work that we did with the fish and crustaceans and squid and gelatinous things, we actually created the first inventory of all of these deep-sea animals that are there. Sampling prior to the spill, unfortunately, had not been very thorough or widespread, and so nothing was actually known about that region except for a couple very short cruises sampling in that area prior to 2010. And so now we have quantitative information on abundances and what species are there. We have distribution maps of where they're found, time series data, and an understanding of the migrations, who migrates, who doesn't, things like that. And so this is actually information that can be used as baseline for the next spill. So what happened to all that oil? Now I'm going to step away from our work on the fish and crustaceans and such and talk more about what has happened in the last 10 years. So a lot of light volatiles actually evaporated right into the air, and BTEX is, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. So these really volatile, small carbon chains. And PAHs is the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, anthracene, naphthalene, stuff like that. They just evaporated. And people on shore, even though the spill was still 50 or more miles offshore, said they could smell the spill. And inhaling that sort of stuff is probably not good for people. The absorbent booms that were used and the controlled burns out at sea got rid of some of it. The warm weather actually degraded some of the oil. Some of it also photo-degraded from sunlight shining on it. Dispersants broke up a lot of it, and some fell to the bottom as tar and marine snow. Marine snow is this little particulate material that's amalgamation of mucus and dust and pollen and all sorts of other things that look sort of like snowflakes. And the oil got incorporated into that, and so brown snowflakes were dropping towards the bottom. By December 2010, the Coast Guard said, oh, the oil's gone. And then 2012, Hurricane Isaac came along and apparently churned up a whole bunch of oil that was on the bottom and started throwing up all of these tar balls and other things onto the beaches. And that's when everyone realized, oh, there's probably a lot more oil out there than we thought. And a 2013 conference said, oh, like 1/3 to 1/2 of the oil may actually have been out there and not coming ashore and such. BP paid a lot for this mishap. They paid out $14 billion just to do the initial cleanups, removal of material during 2010. They set aside $20 billion for damages and loss of income. They hired all of these displaced fishermen who couldn't do their fishing for a period of time. They had to start selling off a lot of their assets in order to pay for a lot of these things. So they sold a refinery, they sold all of their leases in the Gulf. And when it came to the court decision, the fine for just the violation of the Clean Water Act was $18.7 billion. As of the middle of last year, BP has sold off $75 billion worth of assets to pay for all of this. They sold off the Permian Basin stakes that they had and such. They're continuing to pay out individual lawsuits from people who lost business, lost jobs, what have you. And a lot of people, there was a lot of animosity that was going on at the time. People were saying, what is this foreign company doing in our water, drilling for our oil? But the thing was that it wasn't British Petroleum, it was BP. And BP was the name that was selected after British Petroleum merged with the American Oil Company, otherwise known as Amoco. And so BP acquired all of those Gulf leases and such in the acquisition of Amoco. And that's why we've got BP gas stations all over the country still, is because those are the old Amoco stations. So, what's happened since then? Well, microbes did actually eat a lot of oil. This is an image looking at densities of bacteria that are oil-eating bacteria, and you can see there's big blooms of them associated actually with some of the spill just offshore of the Deepwater Horizon, which is that little box right there. And this is an actual oil droplet, and you can see some small bacteria actually chained and linked to that, and also up here as well. They're feeding on that oil, and so they did actually reduce some of the oil in large amounts. How much is really difficult to try and figure out, but they contributed to removing some of the oil. An investigation that started right after the BP oil spill started was to take a retrospective look at another really big oil spill that had occurred previously. And so the Ixtoc-1 oil spill was Pemex, the Mexican oil company, had a blowout similar to what happened with Deepwater Horizon. And this spill just continued for over a year. And the oil continued to oil beaches along Veracruz and on up the Texas coast and such. It ultimately was about 2/3 the size of the BP oil spill, but it had happened 30 years prior to the BP oil spill. And so some investigators from University of South Florida and such went out to take a look and found that if they went to mangroves along the Texas and Mexican coast, they could still find oil 30 years later in the sediment. So that's a kind of preview of what may very well happen with some of the BP oil that's still in the Louisiana marshes and such. For several years after the spill, there were real issues with fishes and crustaceans that were impacted by the oil in many ways. Some of them had lesions like this fish right here, the snapper. For a while, shrimpers were reporting shrimp that didn't have eyes, and so their development was being disrupted by some of the chemicals. That's since diminished, and so these fishes, after about 2015, didn't have the lesions on them, and the crustaceans have gone back to normal development. But in some cases, not the numbers of abundance that used to be prior to the spill. Dolphins and other animal populations, especially larger animals, actually faced greater mortality for an extended period of time. There are images of dolphins actually swimming through the spill itself during 2010. And a number of them died, and when they were examined in autopsies, it was found that they had suffered from things like adrenal toxicity, too much adrenaline in their system, a lung disease, all sorts of blood issues and such. And that continued on until about 2015. And the National Marine Fisheries Service had basically said there were a number of unusual mortality events in the years following up until 2015. Other animals that were impacted, well, any oil that got to the shorelines impacted all kinds of invertebrates. These are hermit crabs covered with oil. Those, fortunately, their populations were replaced fairly quickly by the currents bringing in larvae from other places, and so the coastal areas are looking more like how they did prior to the oil spill. The bottom in the immediate vicinity lost all of the corals, deepwater corals and such that were in that area. They just got overwhelmed by the amount of oil dropping into that area. And other animals like seabirds and sea turtles were directly impacted in the year of the spill, but sea turtles have such long lifespans that they are still in the process of recovering from the losses. The dispersants that were used also appear to have been a lot more problematic than people had realized at the time. And so this is identifying the oil layer in the sediment by using UV fluorescence. You hit it with a UV light and it fluoresces in this sort of orangey yellow color. One of the people who was collecting this, when they fluoresced his legs, they discovered that a number of the contaminants had actually entered through his skin. And so that dispersant actually, in being able to make microdroplets, also makes those droplets penetrate cells more readily. And this has been now demonstrated in some studies on the impact of the dispersants on fish larvae and such. This is a health hazard using this dispersant, although at the time it was the most expedient way of trying to deal with this massive spill. And finally, the oil spill was much more widely distributed than people had realized. And this is a really recent paper, just came out last month. And what they did was they took a look at what the satellite imagery that was being used to figure out how extensive the oil spill was capable of. And what they realized was that people who were making water quality measurements we're actually recording oil present in places where the satellites were not seeing them. And so this visibility threshold right here versus the lower red line is the toxicity threshold for the concentration of contaminants. And so what this means is that there were places where the satellites couldn't see the oil, but it was still toxic water. And when that was mapped out, this is what it looks like. So the brown is the actual oil spill visible through the satellites. The yellow represents the areas where the water was still toxic, but not visible through satellites. And the blue represents areas where it's not at toxic levels. So the oil spill turned out to be much more widespread, and their transport models that they used to show where it went actually shows it reaching the Keys and also going up the Florida East Coast. We just couldn't see it. So what's happening now? This is a huge experiment as to what happens when you put this much oil into a subtropical to tropical region. And given how long oil persisted after the Ishtok 1 spill, it appears that this is going to go on for decades. The impacts on marshes in Louisiana takes time to recover. The oil killed mangroves and salt marsh grasses in many of these places. And salt marsh grasses have been able to recoup, mangroves less so. And so there are several islands in the coastal area where all the mangroves died and the island itself eroded away. And so I said that our data that we collected is information as baseline for the next spill. And the likelihood of more spills has increased because Deepwater Horizon used to be one of the deepest wells out there. At 5,000 feet down, that black dot right there is Deepwater Horizon. There's now a whole new class of wells that are known as ultra-deeps. And ultra-deeps are in the 5,000 to 10,000 foot depth intervals to bottom. And all these rigs out here, all these wells, those are ultra-deeps. Some of these out here are also ultra-deeps. And the deeper the well is, probably the increased chance of another spill. So this is going to be an issue that continues on, and we need to be cognizant of it and vigilant about safety standards and things like that in order to prevent a repeat of what's happened with the BP spill. So I want to acknowledge a number of people, funding sources, organizations that worked with us. A lot of our deep end work was funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, which I should acknowledge was initially funded by BP. BP realized that very little was known about what happens with oil spills this large. And so they basically gave several billions of dollars to a research organization and then walked away and said, do what you want with it, research it, and find out what happens with the oil. And then they had no part at all in determining how the money was spent or the kinds of projects that were funded. LUMCON Fund is the organization that supports the vessel that we use. CSA helps us with the mock nest nets. University of Southern Mississippi owns the vessel that we've been using. BBC paid for some of our cruises, and so some of our videography and such ended up in the Blue Planet 2. And then NRDA or the NOAA for funding us with the NRDA investigation. And if you want more information about our deep end project, you can go to this website. And these are our partner institutions where most of the principal investigators associated with this project are based. And with that, I'll say thank you. And so now I can take any questions. Yes? It's most of the major oil companies have different leases, different blocks out in the Gulf. And so Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Shell, BP sold all of its old leases, but has now acquired new leases closer to shore. So, yes. So, yes. The Obama administration, which was in place at the time of the Deepwater Horizon, several years later imposed regulations with regards to safety and such. And a number of those have been scaled back in the current administration. And so that kind of increases the possibility of further spills. Yes? Deepwater Horizon is not. So the BP spill, they capped that finally towards the very end of July of 2010, and it was declared capped and dead in August. So that one's not leaking, but there are others that are. Oh, I'm sorry. So, yeah, you asked if it was still leaking, and no, it's not. Yes? What eats the microbes that eats oil? There's a number of filter feeders that will feed on those microbes, so sponges and other things, some of the smaller jellies. Probably several trophic layers down. So yeah, anchovies might be eating some of that, but it's as far as I know, not bioaccumulating up the food web to the fish we eat. Oh, they get a fair amount in taxes, in the revenues for all of the workers and such. Yeah, they get a lot financially from any of the work that's done out to about 3 miles, which is state waters, and then any of the business activities that are done on shore. Yes. You know, as far as they were concerned, they didn't have beautiful beaches, they had marshlands, and so the oil was a better way for the state to make money in tax revenues. Yes? Mm-hmm. The way the currents run, yeah, the Big Bend area probably didn't get nearly as much. Now, that's not my study. That's a real recent study that just came out. But yeah, I noticed how there was a portion of the Florida West Coast that didn't really have very much in the way of impacts. Yes? Primary cause. Well, in this case, and one reason why BP ended up paying so much in fines was negligence. They were trying to rush the job in some ways, and so the court found that BP and Halliburton had insufficiently stabilized the well casing, and that's what allowed the methane to get up. But oil spills can be caused by a number of other factors as well. There's something known as the Taylor oil spill. That is it's a rig that was damaged when there was a mudslide, an undersea mudslide, and so the well is now buried underneath all of this mud, and oil is percolating out of it, and it's still spilling oil into the water now. Mm-hmm. Berenstein. 2020, so that's in the, I think it's Marine Pollution Bulletin. Yes? Yes, it does. That was another part of the negligence for BP, was that the blowout preventer, which was supposed to smash closed the well casing, the pipe, failed. And it hadn't been maintained and upkept enough for it to actually work. Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, and that was part of the issue with the reorganization of the federal oversight of oil rigs and such following the BP spill, because the marine minerals, the management service, they ended up having two different and conflicting tasks, one of which was to promote the leases and such, and the other was to regulate. And so that conflict set up part of the situation for what happened. Yes. No, the stocks are not kept on hand, but there's enough oil that naturally leaks into the Gulf of Mexico, small plumes and such, that the bacteria maintain certain populations anyway. Yes? Mm-hmm. That's past, yeah. That was at the time of the spill in 2010, and that's all just washed away. Yes? Deepwater Horizon, it was 5,000 feet of water they had to get through to touch bottom, and then it was like another 20,000 feet into the rock in order to get to the oil reservoirs. So it was a lot of pipe they were putting down there. Yes? A lot of the offshore deeper water rigs have dynamic positioning, meaning that they've got actually a number of thrusters around the whole rig itself and GPS positioning. And so the thrusters are basically holding it in place under all but the most severe weather events. The pipe is moving, and it does have a certain amount of play, given that sort of depth. Yeah. Yes? Yes, I think you can eat them now. I'm not going to guarantee. But yeah, I think they've tested it since then, and they found that the shrimp after 2010, 2011 was below any sort of FDA standards as far as the toxins go. Yes? Yes. That is the biomass that's doing the migration each dawn and dusk is the deep scattering layer, and it represents an enormous biomass. I don't know the figures offhand, but just those little bristle mouths are thought to be the most abundant animal on the planet. They're in the trillions because of the large numbers and extent. Yeah, those sorts of vertical migrations occur in just about all of the ocean basins. The only places it doesn't regularly occur are in the polar oceans. You could measure it approximately with sonar. Using that image came from multi-beam sonar. Now, it used to be that sonar was just a single ping down and look at the echo. But with multi-beam, it's now an array of sound that's going down and coming back and at different frequencies. And you can start using the information for those multiple frequencies to start getting a sense of just what the volume and what the biomass may represent. I would think possibly, yes. It is referred to as the world's largest migration, and it is an enormous amount of fish and shrimp and crustaceans and squid and such that are making that daily migration. All right? One more. They do have protocols for stopping any sort of pumping, and they also do have ways of protecting the rigs. Although, if you're that far out at sea, you could be facing 40, 50-foot waves. But we haven't had that many rigs actually sink. They've got procedures and such. I'm not an oil rigger, and so I'm not really as cognizant of the various techniques they use. The floating rigs like the Deepwater Horizon, those pontoons that were on the bottom are actually filled partially with water, and that helps stabilize the rig in the water itself. And frequently those pontoons go deep so that the rig itself holds still even though the waves are sloshing around a lot. So there's a lot of different ways that they can deal with that. We done?
I think we can be done, guys. Can you help me thank John for coming up and joining us again tonight?